If you grew up with trauma, there's a good chance that the red flags in your relationship didn't look like danger. They looked familiar. Let me start by saying this plainly. Childhood trauma sucks. And one of the hardest part, at least for me, is that trauma rewires your brain in so many ways that you don't even realize until years into your adulthood. I didn't understand this at 19. I barely understood this at 30. And honestly, I'm still working to rewire those neural pathways. And one of the biggest ways that trauma shows up is that it makes identifying red flags very hard. Trauma does this thing where it trains your brain to normalize danger. When abuse or emotional instability is your baseline growing up, your brain learns that this is normal, that this is what relationships feel like, and that discomfort feels familiar, not alarming. And that shows up later in very subtle ways. In toxic or bad relationships, I didn't feel like I was in danger. It just felt like home. So when someone was emotionally inconsistent or warm one moment and cold the next, or controlling but framed it as helpful, that didn't trigger an alarm. It just triggered recognition. Growing up, red flags were often linked with love, approval, or survival. As a child, noticing something was wrong wasn't always allowed, and sometimes it was actually very dangerous. And for me, I learned early on that questioning adults led to punishment or withdrawal, and discomfort had to be swallowed to keep the peace. That love required silence, tolerance, or self-abandonment. So my system adapted in a way that was actually very smart at the time. I ignored warning signs to preserve that attachment and safety. And that adaptation doesn't shut off the moment you turn 18. And that's why many of us, myself included, have stayed in unhealthy relationships far longer than we should have. Because preserving attachment can feel much safer than being alone or being abandoned. Trauma also scrambles what I call your internal alarm system. Chronic childhood stress can blunt or scramble those danger signals. And for me, that looked like this. I could intellectually notice that something wasn't right, but emotionally, it never fully landed, or it didn't feel important enough to act upon. So for me, that meant that subtle red flags didn't register, or big red flags felt maybe confusing instead of urgent. And so you might notice issues intellectually, but not emotionally. And so I'd think things like, this doesn't feel great, but then it would immediately follow with, but it's probably not that bad. And that's why so many survivors often say that they can see danger clearly for other people, but not for myself. And your insight and my insight isn't broken necessarily, but our signal timing is. With that context, I want to share some relationship red flags that I personally experienced and learned slowly, sometimes painfully and uncomfortably, to recognize and avoid. Let's talk about boyfriend number 1. My first serious relationship actually gave me an early lesson, even if I didn't fully name it at the time. He was mostly a taker. I drove us everywhere. I rearranged my schedule. I gave a lot. And I remember noticing something small but very telling. He never said thank you. He wasn't a bad person, just immature, unmotivated, and unappreciative. Another big issue is that intimacy wasn't mutual. It was centered around him and not connection. And my needs were not really part of that equation. He had big goals, but no follow-through unless someone else was pushing him. At the time, that was me. And about a year in, I had this moment of clarity where I said to myself, it's like, I'm really unhappy. I don't feel valued. I don't feel good physical intimacy. This isn't working. And I left. And honestly, good for me, because I didn't know that later all the time when I should have. I was really proud of myself for ending this 1-year-long relationship, despite my parents talking about how he would propose soon and we should get married. They really seemed to think getting married at 18 was a good idea. Oh my goodness. I didn't know it then, but that was me listening to my body before I learned how to intellectualize my way out of it. And I wish I'd continued trusting myself in that clarity as I got older, but what can I say? Growth isn't always linear. As soon as I got out of that relationship, I ended up diving right into dating a man who would become husband number 1. This relationship had many red flags that trauma completely disguised as safety for me. Let's start with the easy one. I was 19 when we started dating. He was 31. Instead of asking myself, why does a 31-year-old want to date a literal teenager? I thought to myself, well, he's mature, he's responsible, he's safe. He was also my boss. And at the time, that felt very reassuring. It's like he was somebody that knew what they were doing, someone I could look up to, someone who must be responsible and dependable. He was in a management position after all. What I didn't understand yet was that authority can sometimes feel like safety when you grew up without it. I later learned that this man had a long history of dating people in subordinate positions, and my opinion and evaluation much later on is that he only seemed happy if he was in a position to feel like he was better than his partner. Early on, he love bombed me. Constant praise, intense attention, big promises. In case you haven't heard that term before, love bombing is a manipulation tactic where someone overwhelms you early on to create attachment and dependency, and then withdraws it when they feel secure later on. For me, who had never really felt loved before, I felt chosen, which distracted from the fact that he wasn't actually contributing much to the relationship. And then, the moment we got engaged, something changed. The minimal effort that he was doing stopped. The affection and love bombing that he was doing once effectively disappeared. And I slowly became the one carrying the relationship. For me, it felt like he decided, well, I've caught her. I don't need to try anymore. I planned the wedding alone. I handled the finances. I spent a year working to get him out of massive collection debt before the wedding by managing all of our money. I managed the household. When we later took custody of my sisters, I distinctly remember thinking that this doesn't really feel like a partnership. It feels like I have 3 teenagers in this house instead of 2. And then he would say things like he wanted kids, and I was just aghast. He wasn't helping with anything now. How on earth would I manage with a baby as well? There were other things too. I felt like his control tactics increased the longer we were together. I got promoted. I became a manager of my job, and heaven forbid, I started making more money than him. And it kind of became clear that he was not happy when I was no longer subordinate to him anymore, which I think took away some of his perceived power. So he tried to take it in other ways. He tried to control how I dressed. He criticized my appearance. He would refuse to go somewhere with me if I didn't wear a bra or didn't dress nice enough for his taste. He made jealousy out of thin air. I remember one night we were at a strip club with all his military buddies, of all places, where he became convinced that I was somehow cheating on him with a stripper. And it was one of these military buddies that was with us that had to intervene to tell him he was being crazy, while here I was scared and crying at his anger and his outbursts at me. I laugh now, honestly, because it's truly absurd. But at the time, I was just really confused and I was really sad. And that confusion and sadness became my normal for a while before I finally got up the nerve to get divorced. My needs consistently came second to his. I remember once when I was really sad, genuinely sad, and he said to me, I thought I was dating a strong, independent woman. I don't want to be with somebody who's depressed. And that sentence in that one moment taught me something very dangerous, that my feelings and my genuine sadness and ups and downs with anxiety and depression made me unlovable. So I learned to hide those emotions, anything that wasn't happy or positive or supportive. And that mentality stuck with me for a really long time and into multiple relationships after the fact. And then there was broken promises. After I discovered his affair, he promised to change. We were both supposedly willing to fix things. We both agreed that we'd go to therapy. He promised to end his affair. And those promises were repeated probably 7 or 8 times, with never actually any outcome that he promised. And eventually I realized that promises without follow-through are a major red flag. And not once, but a pattern of them is really bad. Thankfully, I finally decided that I couldn't trust him anymore and I got a divorce. But later relationships echoed some of these same patterns and themes. I dated people who didn't know what they wanted well into adulthood. And then there was me ignoring the fact that our goals didn't align in favor of what they wanted instead of what I wanted. I would hear contradictions and I would choose to believe the one that was my most hopeful interpretation of what they said. I often was the only one reaching out, having my time or priorities minimized. There were relationships where big promises were made the moment I was ready to leave, and my desires were being treated as less valid than theirs. One person later on, after I'd gotten some therapy, once told me he didn't agree to the breakup and that I was supposed to ask him permission first before I broke up with him. And I remember laughing with my girlfriends later, just saying, do you think that I'm supposed to ask permission to leave the relationship? And that laugh was clarity, and it really showed that I had gone through quite a bit of healing by that point. Now let's also talk about friendships. Friendships also have red flags that I sometimes ignored. I stayed in friendships where I did all the emotional labor, or that where conflict was explosive and unresolved, and apologies never came. Just this past year, I finally stepped out of a cycle that I hadn't even realized I was in. There was a friend of mine who would treat me horribly, and he'd have these explosive blow-ups, and I would ignore it in favor of our shared goals in the nonprofit that we were both part of. Last time he did that and had an explosive blow-up at me, I promised that I wouldn't let them back in until they apologized. And a year later, they never did. A month or so into that commitment to myself, my husband said something that stuck with me. He said, "Remember, every few months they treat you horribly. You cry for weeks about how frustrated you are and how dysfunctional this relationship is. And then you pretend it never happened and you go on being friends with him. I'm so glad you're cutting ties." And he was right. Walking away actually brought a lot of peace, not guilt. And this was huge, and it just goes to show that I still have a lot of work to do in seeing red flags and setting appropriate boundaries with the people I care about. Now, I want to reframe this for us for a second. You did not miss red flags because you're bad at boundaries. Just like me, you missed them because we were trained to tolerate what others shouldn't have done. Our systems prioritized connection over protection. Our instincts formed in an environment where leaving wasn't an option. That's not a character flaw. What that is that's a survival imprint. Looking back, the red flags were there, but they didn't register to me as danger. They registered as familiar. And when familiarity is all we knew growing up, it can feel like home and comfort, even when it hurts. And this understanding really matters. Once we as survivors understand this pattern, we can stop shaming ourselves for our past choices. We can start trusting delayed clarity. And we can learn to treat discomfort as information, not as a personal failing. Over time, red flags don't just become visible. They start feeling loud, and it becomes much easier for us to act on them. I'm sure many of you are just like me. We're still working on identifying red flags, and then the even harder part of cutting ties with those red flag waving people. I think it's really important that we are kind to ourselves. It takes a lot of time to reprogram our brains, and it's never too late to learn boundaries. And I just want to say again, I wish you the best on your healing journey. I really appreciate you being here today. I'm Janae Cherie, and I hope that my story helps you to tell yours. Thanks for being here with me. If you'd like to walk this journey together, you can subscribe or check out another video here.